it is a pleasure to be back in Philadelphia. PolicyLink actually had, I'm not sure whether to call it the first or second. I'll call it the first since it was in Philadelphia. The first national summit on equitable development. The reason I hesitate whether it was first or second is we actually had the first one in Los Angeles in November of 2002. We didn't call it a summit on equitable development at that time because we hadn't quite gotten the language together, but that's what it was about. At that first one, we thought it would be wonderful if we could have a national conversation about equity and regional equity. If we could get at least 250 people to come, if we could attract people from about 20 different states. We had to close down registration at 650. We had over 40 states, and we had a very diverse gathering. We had the second one in Philadelphia in May of 2005, and it was a huge success, attracting about 1,500 people. So I have a very special connection to Philadelphia and the topic of equitable development. I want to talk to you about a number of things today. I want to start off telling you a little bit about myself. Those of you who have heard me speak before have probably heard me say this before. But I grew up in a segregated St. Louis, Missouri in the 1950s and the early 60s. And what I observed growing up and then going back to St. Louis after I moved away, I never lived there again after I went away to college, but my parents lived there until 1996 when they moved to Oakland, where I was living. So I was constantly going back to St. Louis. And growing up there and watching what happened over time has been so instructive for me at every job, every endeavor that I've been in, because all of my life has been devoted to trying to improve community, create greater economic, social opportunity, create a more just society. That experience of community growing up in St. Louis, that experience of seeing a city that was, when I was growing up, it was the 9th largest city in the United States, 900,000 people. Now St. Louis probably hovers around 300,000 and isn't even mentioned in the top 50. Seeing it move from being the 9th largest city in the United States to where it is now, seeing what happened when the schools integrated in 1954, and watching what became called white flight, that has happened again and again and again as people have moved out to suburban communities, watching what happened in the 1960s when civil rights legislation was passed and the black middle class was able to move outside of the historically black community when they had access to live other places, watching what happened to the extraordinary community that I grew up in that was rich in every way. I often tell people that I have lived many places since I lived on the 4900 block of Terry, but never have I lived in a more integrated community than that one, which was almost all black because it was economically integrated. It was economically integrated because all the black people lived in the same community. So the doctors and the lawyers and the ministers and the contractors lived there, as well as single mothers who were receiving AFDC, and janitors, and people who were bagging groceries. Whatever black people did, we all lived together. Living in that economically integrated, mixed income community was extraordinary. Seeing what happened when that was not the case anymore, that experience of growing up in St. Louis, Missouri, I'm very thankful for it because it adds nuance and texture to the kind of policy discussions that we're having right now. I've been telling the story of growing up in St. Louis, Missouri for 25, 30 years, and never has it been more interesting than it is today. When I tell people I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, people look up, they have questions, they want to know what that was like, they want to know did I ever go to Ferguson, they want to know did I ever know anybody in Ferguson. And the truth of the matter is, no, we did not go to Ferguson when I was growing up. That area was all white. My brother, I have an older brother, who said that they knew you don't get caught in Ferguson after sundown. So we grew up at a time when Ferguson was a complete white community, though in my going back to St. Louis, I did have friends who I went to high school with who were trying to do the right thing for themselves and their families. They were trying to move to places where they thought the schools would be better. They were trying to move to places where they thought there'd be more job opportunities. They were trying to move to neighborhoods where they thought they would be safe. And so I have said to people when they've asked me about what I know about Ferguson growing up in St. Louis, and what I know about Ferguson growing up in St. Louis is that it's not surprising that the unrest that we're experiencing all across the nation, that urban unrest would have started in Ferguson. Because you get unrest when you have hope. When Black veterans returned from World War II, coming back to this country, having fought in the war, they actually had hope that things were going to be different. When they came back and things were not different, we had urban unrest. We had urban unrest again in the 60s when civil rights legislation had passed, and people thought the passage of civil rights legislation was going to make it better. People had hope. When those hopes were dashed, we had urban unrest. It is not surprising that it would be the suburbs and not the city around St. Louis where people were moving, trying to find a better life and finding the same old thing, that we got the kind of reaction that we've gotten. So I'm going to be talking about equitable development, but I want to start right off talking about the national conversation that we're thinking about having about race. And I say we're thinking about having it because we're never sure we're going to have it. We're never sure we can have it. We're never sure we can stomach it. We're never quite sure we can stick with it. We're thinking about having it, and that's a good thing. I hope that you're thinking about having it, because when you think about trying to promote equitable development, trying to build a fully inclusive Philadelphia and Philadelphia region, you really do have to think about historically, how have we gotten to this place? But the main thing I want to talk about is equity. Equity, just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. The equity conversation is a new conversation. We were talking about equal opportunity and equality for many, many, many years, and while we never achieved it, we certainly thought that that was the ideal, to make sure that everybody got the same things, had the same opportunity to go to a school that was open the same number of days during the year, get to go to a school where teachers have the same training, where they're using the same books and curriculum. That we really had a notion that if we could get things right on the input side, so that we were putting things in equally, that we would be creating a level playing field. I think we have discovered that that is not true. That when we think about education, which is what I was just talking about, I'll just stick with that for a moment. Equity, just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. In the education context, what that means is that children can go to school, achieve at high levels, graduate, and go on to higher education and careers. If we're going to have that happen for all children in the region, probably we are not talking about equality. What we're saying is, here's the goal, here's the result that we want, and then you have to back into what the inputs are going to be in order to get there. Some children are lucky enough to be born into families that can provide the enrichment activities after school and in the summer that you need, so they're not dependent just on a good school. Of course, they're going to send their children to good school. They're going to move to a neighborhood where there's a good school. If they can't do that, they're going to find a way to pay to send their kids to a good school. Families that have resources take good school for granted. They're going to provide that, but they don't just depend on that. The enrichment activities are important. Being able to have a place where children can study and have support in their study if need be. Making sure that children are healthy and that they start school ready to learn, already knowing their colors and their ABCs and those kind of essentials. If you come from a family or from a community where that does not exist, then we're going to have to put a whole lot more into your education. We're going to have to do the kinds of things that they do at the Harlem Children's Zone, where they have created a good school. It's a charter school. It's called the Promise Academy, and it is excellent. But Jeff Cannon and his colleagues have decided that they can't just depend on a good school. They have to wrap all of these services around the children so that the things that we have determined work for education, and we have had a decade upon decade experiment in which families with resources have proven that if you provide all of these other things for children and a good school, children will achieve at high levels. They are doing that with extraordinary intervention in Harlem and in other places all around the country. That's what equity requires. Equity asks, where do we want people to be? And then backs into what you're going to have to provide in order for people to get there. That's equity. But when you think about equity in the United States of America, you immediately get into a conversation about place. Because sadly, we live in a nation in which where you live is a proxy for opportunity. Where you live determines whether or not you're fortunate enough to have a good school on the corner. Where you live determines whether you live near a job or near a public transit system that can connect you with a good job any place in the region. Where you live determines whether or not you live in a natural job network. If I ask you to raise your hands, if the first job you ever got came from a connection, I'm sure most of your hands would go up. It was an uncle, it was a parent, it was a neighbor, it was somebody in your faith institution, it was somebody at the community center, it was a teacher who knew your family and took a special interest in you. People get jobs through natural job networks, and if you don't live in one, you're at a disadvantage. Where you live determines that. Where you live determines if you're fortunate enough to own a home, whether you have any value you can pull out of it in case of an emergency or to take advantage of an educational or an entrepreneurial opportunity. And where you live even determines how long you will live. It's so sad that if you give me your zip code, I can let you know your life expectancy. In the area where I live, in Oakland, California, there's a 15-year difference between people who live in the Berkeley Hills and people who live in the West Oakland Flatlands, a distance of only a few miles. Where you live even determines how long you will live and how well you'll live while you live, whether or not you're likely to have diabetes or heart disease or hypertension or any number of things that are very much associated with place. And so when we think about equity, we can't think about equity separate from place. And as we look at how the places where people live have placed them at severe disadvantage, we know that this has come out of our development pattern. It's the development patterns that have determined every single thing I've talked about. Communities that are without grocery stores, that is because of the way that we have invested. Communities that are without parks and open space, or they have parks, but they're not safe, they're not beautiful, they're not staffed. That's our development pattern that determines that. Whether you live in an area that is isolated or whether you live in an area that is connected has to do with our development decisions in terms of public transit. The majority of people who use public transportation are low-income people of color. The people who are least likely to have cars are low-income people of color. We ought to be making almost all of our public transit decisions based on what low-income people need in order to connect to opportunity. So place and development absolutely go together. We spent a long time not really thinking about that. I think that community development movement has really been at the forefront in so many ways and has moved with the times. It used to be that CDCs felt that they had done a good job when they had put attractive housing in a poor community. But when you think about it, attractive housing in a community that is not near schools, that's not near public transit, that's not near a grocery store, that's not in a safe community, have we really helped the family by giving them attractive housing in that community? Well, the community development movement has actually moved from that to understanding that there's a greater obligation. And that greater obligation is to foster equitable development. When I talk about equitable development, I'm really talking about four things. One is consciously integrating a focus on people with a focus on place. For too long, we have worked in those silos that we keep calling out, but they are real. We have absolutely worked in silos so that we have one group of people working over here trying to get people job training and job ready, and a whole different group of people training for a different discipline, spending their time in different places after work and before work, hanging out in different parts of town, developing elegant transportation systems. If you don't integrate the focus on the transportation system with the focus on the people who are trying to get job ready, you're going to have people ready for jobs that they can't get to. You're going to have public transit systems that are not serving the public. We have to integrate the people and the place strategies. And it goes well beyond jobs and public transit. It goes to things like education and environment and housing, where we put housing, makes so much difference. That one of the things that I think about when I think about equitable development is that we need to have strategies that allow people to live near opportunity, strategies that allow people to connect to opportunity wherever that might be, that's your transportation, and your job linkage programs, and strategies that help every community to be a community of opportunity. But this notion of integrating people in place is central to equitable development. The next thing is being able to develop in a way that consciously reduces disparities. The disparities that exist in this country do not have to be. All of them can be addressed, whether we're talking about disparities in wealth, in income, in health, in education, whatever the disparity is, we need to use our development work to consciously reduce those disparities. You all have actually led the way for the nation in terms of thinking about access to healthy food. And I thank you for that. The work that the Food Trust and the Reinvestment Fund and the state and the city did to be able to actually advance the Pennsylvania Fresh Food Financing Initiative has just changed the face of the nation in terms of knowing this is a problem that can be solved. It has to become a part of what we're doing with development all across the country and always thinking about developing grocery stores in communities, using those grocery stores as a way to get people working, to bring back the economic life of the community, to be able to make sure that people have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, reducing disparities. Thinking about connecting people to transportation. Transportation is just a lifeline in so many ways, and we have not spent enough time making sure that we're putting housing near transportation and transportation near housing. The Obama administration has picked this up with the Choice Neighborhoods Initiative, with the Sustainable Communities Initiative, and it has been so refreshing to see the federal government actually working in partnership with community builders and community developers and local communities as they're trying to think about how to be able to develop in ways that reduce disparities. But we also need to reduce disparities by thinking about income and jobs. It was really heartening during the last election to see so many jurisdictions around the country increase the minimum wage. It is so important to be able to do things like that so that we're actually thinking about the jobs and the jobs that people are going to get, paying enough for them to support families. The next thing we need to think about, equitable development looks for triple bottom line returns. Economic return for investors, community benefits for people in communities, and environmental benefits. Recently in Oakland, the Oakland Army base has been neglected. It's shut down about 25 years ago. And for 25 years, we kept hearing plans for the Oakland Army base. Finally, last year, the Oakland Army base came back to life, and it's come back as an international logistics center. The community demanded community benefits. City government happy to respond and work with community to come up with a package of benefits. And that is progress in and of itself. When community benefits first started, and I think we give Los Angeles credit and the Staples Center for giving us the first model of how to make sure that you get community benefits embedded in development. We've come a long way from the fight in Los Angeles to the harmonious coming together of an extraordinary community benefits package in Oakland. We're getting to the point where community benefits are starting to be embedded in the development process, embedded in planning, embedded in economic development, and that's as it should be. But for this logistics center, several things. One, it's huge. $800 million project will cover a landmass that's equal to 200 football fields, expected to develop 3,000 jobs within the first couple of years. One of the things that they were able to get is that half of those jobs will definitely go to Oakland residents, which is huge, because so many times you have these big development projects and people come from outside to get the jobs. The next thing is they're going to reduce to a minimum the use of temporary agencies. And you know that's the way it usually happens now. You've got a big contracting thing, the temporary agencies come in, they do a lot of that work, and that means that permanent jobs are not created, that people who are local don't get the job, so they're going to consciously reduce the use of temporary agencies. 25% of all apprenticeship hours will go to the most vulnerable, veterans, formerly incarcerated, long-term unemployed. They made sure that they started a whole year before they broke ground, training people for jobs in a job placement center that was located in the low-income community right there in Oakland. So for a whole year, right there in the low-income community, people were getting ready for those jobs. They are really working with the entrepreneurs to make sure that the contracting is increasing those wealth-building opportunities. And it's going to be environmentally sound because they are actually getting those trucks off the road and moving shipments by rail, which is better for the environment. So this is an example of really looking for triple bottom line results, and you've got to do that in the development process. But the last thing that is essential for equitable development is to make sure that the community has voice and agency in the development process. That community voice and agency is absolutely essential. And it doesn't just mean that you come to a meeting and you put stickers on the wall, or you get to see a plan and say whether or not you like it, or one person gets picked to be on a committee. Real voice, participation, and agency means participation every step of the way. It means being there in the beginning when something is being planned, to talk about what do people in the neighborhoods feel that they need, what are they worried about in terms of this project. It means being part of the planning process, being able to look at scales and models and move things around and see where you are. What does this mean for your children? What does this mean for the elderly people in your community? What does this mean for jobs and recreation and your faith institution? It means being able to have jobs and to have say as the thing is being built. And it means being part of evaluating, measuring whether or not it's having the impact and making corrections as things go forward. Real voice, participation, and agency is the level of community engagement that's needed. So that's equitable development. But equitable development actually has to happen in real time. It has to happen right now. When we had the summit on equitable development in Philadelphia in May of 2005, we were very concerned then about gentrification. And because some places like San Francisco and Boston and Washington, D.C. were gentrifying fast, and people were concerned about that. Other places like Cleveland and Baltimore and Philadelphia were not gentrifying at all. And the concern was, how do you begin to think about equitable development in the context of older core cities and not just hot markets? And that was a big part of the conversation we had at that time. It's been almost 10 years, and a lot has changed in those 10 years. A lot has changed. One of the things that's changed, though it may not feel like it in Philadelphia, but the demographics of the nation have changed a lot in 10 years, and they are changing fast. Since 2012, the majority of all babies born in this country have been babies of color. Since 2012. Right now, the majority of all children in this country, 5 and under, are Latino, Asian, Native American, African American, or mixed in some other way. By the end of this decade, and I always say we are going through this decade like a hot knife through soft butter, aren't we? We will be through with this decade by the time I sit down. By the end of this decade, the majority of all children in this country will be of color. And yes, by 2043, the majority of the country will be of color, but it'll be beside the point by the time we get to 2043, because by 2030, the majority of the young workforce will be of color. And by 2032, the majority of all low-wage workers will be of color. The median age for white people in this country is 42. The median age for Latinos, the fastest growing population, is 27. The population is changing. It's going to continue to change. What I have just described is inevitable. You can be nostalgic for a time that never was if you want to, but the future is inevitable, and we need to get ready for it. And what does this mean? It means that everything the nation needs, it has. You know, so many of the European countries are twisting their hands about the fact that they're aging so rapidly. The United States of America remains a young country for exactly the reason that I just said. It's a gift to have that youth. Entrepreneurship is going to be so important. Innovation, we hear about innovation all the time. Innovation and entrepreneurship go together. Asians, Latinos, African Americans are 3 times as likely as white people to start businesses. So you have that entrepreneurial spirit still very much alive here in this country. People just raring to go. When we think about the aging population that is white and people who are thinking that they're going to retire, they need people to buy their homes so that they can move back to wherever it is they want to go or move to whatever place they want to experience for the first time. They need for people to be able to buy their homes. Who are those people going to be? We need a middle class. The thing that has made this country great has been its middle class. You think about any poor country that comes to mind. What makes it poor is not the absence of rich people. What makes it poor is the absence of a middle class. This country is going to become like those countries if we don't figure out a way for the people who are going to be the future to be the middle class. If people of color don't become the middle class, there'll be no middle class. There'll be nobody to buy homes. There'll be nobody to do all of the things that we need to have happen. I mention this because this is the time in which we're talking about equitable development. When the agenda for full inclusion, just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential, that agenda has become more urgent than ever. It's not just something that we do to help those who are being left behind because it's the right thing to do, though it surely is the right thing to do, and we should do it for that reason. But there is another reason to do it. It has become an economic imperative. It has become a national imperative. If we don't get the equity agenda right, we don't get America right. And so when we're thinking about equity in this context, there is urgency for everybody. This has to be everybody's agenda. So when we talk about equitable development, it can't be an add-on. It has to be the essential work. We have to make sure that every infrastructure investment that we're making is thinking about how to produce equity, whether we're looking at stormwater runoff, which produces jobs, it produces opportunity, it brings communities back, it helps us to be able to think in new ways about how to integrate communities. We have to think about who's going to get those jobs, what places are going to be improved. We have to put forward the equity agenda. I'm just going to mention transportation one more time, and I may mention it 5 more times before I stop, because it is so essential that we have to think about those infrastructure investments in terms of how they produce equity. And we've got to think about the economy in terms of how it produces equity. To be able to advance the equity agenda, we have to grow good jobs. We have to increase the wages for low-wage jobs. We have to help low-wage jobs become good jobs. And you know, many jobs that we think of as good jobs, they're not inherently good jobs. They're good jobs because they pay well, because they have good benefits. Collecting garbage, I'm sure that has not always been thought of as a good job, but that's a good job these days. It pays good wages, it has good benefits. We have to think about how to grow good jobs. Think about the jobs that people are doing and make those the jobs that people can use to be able to have enough money to live in decent places to send their children to college. We need to increase the minimum wage. We need to make sure that jobs have the wraparound benefits that are important. But we also have to build capabilities. 47% of all jobs in 2018 will require at least an associate's degree. Only 27% of Blacks and Latinos have associate degrees. Only 15% of foreign-born Latinos. You see what's happening there. We've got to be able to build those capabilities. And there's some wonderful examples of that happening. The state of Tennessee has just passed a bill that says that every student who graduates from high school gets 2 years of free community college. And that any student who graduates from community college automatically can go to a 4-year institution. It's the only states that have done that, and that's what we ought to have every place. We ought to be talking pre through 14, not K through 12, but pre through 14. That's how we begin to build capabilities. There are wonderful programs where community colleges are working directly with industry to be able to build the capabilities that industry needs. In California, our energy company, PG&E, recognized that